Thank you ever so much, Francis, and thank you, Mark Perryman, for organising me and getting me here on time, which is great. I should tell you something about myself. Most of you have no idea who I am. If you Google me, you'll discover I'm a professor at the University of Oxford. What you may not know is I joined the Labour Party 41 years ago. I then lapsed. I'm a lapsed something else, but Lewes is not the town to mention that other thing in, for those who know. I'm currently a Labour Party member. I was brought up in a Labour family. My mum used to run Labour committee rooms in Risinghurst in Oxford. My grandfather claimed that if he'd managed to get back from Berlin in time in 1945, he would have been allowed to stand in a seat that would never have been won, normally by Labour, and he would have become an MP. And that's the story of my granddad's life, is all about how he couldn't get back from Berlin in time. So that's enough about me. How to solve Britain's inequality crisis. There are 4 parts to this half an hour. And I'm going to try and tell you things that may surprise you. So I'm not going to go through stuff you think I should go through, because many of you will have heard that kind of thing before. I'm going to try and tell you things that may be new to you. The first is the good news. The second is the bad news. The third is the mundane news. And the fourth is what we have to do to be brave. So there is a structure, if you're wondering as I go through this. The good news, and this appears in the footnotes of 7 Children, that book I published in September, and again in the footnotes of Peak Inequality, because I was very nervous about good news. I was nervous about the statistics I was seeing over the last few years, and I was nervous about calling it out and saying something good is happening. By the way, I'm sure I will give you lots of statistics about awful things that are going on at the moment in the UK. But the good news is surprising. The last time the UK was at a peak of income inequality was around about 1918, over 100 years ago, at the end of the First World War. We were incredibly unequal then. The most common job for women was to work in service. The richest 1% of the 1% had an income 400 times the average. They had the country houses. Wealth inequalities were the highest they had possibly ever been. And this was normal across Europe. So it was an absolutely depressing time in 1918, because the gaps between rich and poor had never been wider, and there wasn't a model of somewhere in the world which was that different. However, we just had a war which had lasted many more years than we had expected it to. We'd got into debt, we had to pay for that war. The only way to pay for it was to tax the rich. Inheritance tax was increased, other taxes were increased. There was austerity for those with the most. Salaries and wages at the very top, building society bosses, flatlined for 20 years. Unions agitated. They went on strike. The strikes of the 1920s dwarfed the strikes of the 1970s, which dwarfed the strikes we've had in the last few years. There was a general strike. There were rent strikes. Rent regulation was brought in. The UK became more and more equal every year after 1918. The majority of the equality that we won was won by 1939. The majority of the gap that you can measure between us disappeared by 1939. Nobody celebrated the 20s and the 30s, right? And this is part of the downside of the good news, is that when inequalities begin to fall, it generally isn't a joyous moment. But those reductions in inequalities carried on in the 1940s, were accelerated by the 45 government, which was in some ways a coalition. You can argue later, but the Conservatives had moved to the left, the Liberals moved to the left, Lord Beveridge was a Liberal, the Tories didn't completely scupper the creation of the NHS, which was something we simply had to do because we were yet again bankrupt. So that by the 1960s, the UK had become one of the most equal countries in Europe, and by 1973, we were the second most equal country in Europe, large country, to Sweden. And then it all went the other way. Until the last 6 years, where if you measure the gap between rich and poor in this country in the last 6 years, it stops rising and at certain points it actually falls. But we've had a cost of living crisis. So almost everybody has got worse off. One statistic for you to try to illustrate this. Real wages peaked around about 2008. We're in the longest wage stagnation period since 1798. Senior civil servants have seen their pay fall in real terms by 25% since 2008. Junior civil servants have seen their pay fall in real terms by 12%. If the people who are paid the most have a 25% reduction, and the people who are paid less have a 12% reduction, the gap between them becomes narrower. Inequality falls. Nobody is happy. The senior civil servants can't help their adult children as they expected to. They can't have what they consider to be quite a modest holiday in a caravan in the south of France anymore. The junior civil servants can't pay the rent to live near where they're working. Nobody celebrates this kind of fall in inequality, but it is happening. When the cost of living crisis was at its worst, the Conservative government increased benefits by inflation. That was higher than the rises in wages. So we had benefits going, which are the lowest benefits in Europe, admittedly, but benefits going up proportionately more than wages. House prices stopped rising at the rate they were before. There was a rise during the pandemic. That occurred around the world in every country in which a large number of elderly people died. We can touch on that later. The only country which didn't see house price rises was China, in which not many elderly people died. I'm being braver describing this to you here than I have done in my books because it could be temporary, I could be wrong. There were times, the first 4 months of the pandemic, saw things get dramatically worse for the poor. And we have destitution, we have people going hungry, we have people starving at a rate that we haven't had since the 1930s. We have children getting shorter. We have absolute rising mortality rates of children now in this country, to a point where we don't measure it. If you look at the United Nations measure of child poverty and how it's changed over the last 7 years, for every country that the UN monitors, most countries have had a big fall in child poverty. It's a really good story. Places like Korea have had a fall. The country which has had the largest increase in child poverty in the world is the UK. Right? So I'm not saying things are good here, but I'm saying that something different has begun to happen already. And it's important, I think, not to miss it. Way back in 2018, 2019, trade unions used to argue for flat rate increases. The Communication Workers Union argued and won, I think, a 3% increase for all their members. Now, if you're a highly paid, normally older male telecoms engineer, 3% of your wage is a lot of money. If you're a lowly paid, more often woman and young, represented by CWU, 3% of your very low income It's not much. So trade unions arguing for 3% for everybody increases the absolute gaps. But that's the last time they did it. Almost every union deal since 2019, every one I've been able to find, has been progressive every year. They've argued for their lower paid workers to have a higher increase than their higher paid workers. All management have been clever. And they've turned around to the unions and said, look, we're not going to give you what you want. And yes, your workers are much worse off than they were a year or two ago because the cost of food and heating and gas have gone up. But we're willing to offer you 9 or 10% of people on the very bottom scales, and then maybe a 4% increase of people on the top, while inflation is hanging around at 17%. And it's quite hard for a trade union official not to accept a progressive pay deal, although it's interesting that for decades they didn't. It's not just the trade unions, and this is anecdotal, but in our right-wing press, I've heard, because often they don't have unions, that you get a pay increase on your first 40, 60 or 80,000 pounds, but no increase on the income above that, because the firms employing them are running out of money. Right. Now, this could be temporary, but it is the first time since 1918 that this has happened. And once it begins to happen, once you begin to see the gap narrowing between better off and worse off people, it's quite hard to say, oh no, that's gone far enough, particularly when you have the highest income inequality in all of Europe, give or take Bulgaria. Government can do a lot to make this happen more quickly. We should learn from the 1920s and 30s that this is how it happened here before. We should learn from other countries in Europe, all of which are more equal than us. We should realise that although we have the highest tax rates for 70 years, we still have the lowest tax rates in Europe apart from Ireland and Switzerland, and that's because of their strange economies. There's a lot we could do. The only person I think who realised that income inequality fell in the 20s and 30s was a PhD student at the London School of Economics called Hugh Dalton, who later became Chancellor of the Exchequer. And it was his PhD was measuring this thing. Nobody measured income inequality in the 20s or the 30s. So that's your good news. Something's already begun. And it began without political leaders actually trying to get it to happen. It began under the Conservatives. But it was helped by politicians. It was helped by people like Jeremy Corbyn putting the word inequality 33 times into the 2017 manifesto, right? Putting it up the agenda. Worldwide, when you survey people about the biggest crisis in the world, absolutely number one, and this is the world's middle class, including China and India, the number one crisis in the world for the majority of the world's middle class is income inequality, poverty, and cost of living. And before the cost of living crisis, it was inequality and poverty. That may strike you as odd, but that's because we're in Lewes, okay? And this is not a typical part of the middle class. If I was to survey you, you may well give me what is number 6 in the world as the biggest crisis. Number 6 in the world is climate change. The middle class of the world do not worry about the climate as much as they worry about just getting by. Secondly, unemployment. Thirdly, basic services like schools and can they get healthcare. And then war and terrorism, all these other concerns. I've got a book coming out next year called The Next Crisis, where I thought I was very clever because I've been trying to point out the evidence that it really does matter to people if they're doing badly and think they're doing worse than 4 years earlier. Unfortunately for me, and probably for the United States of America, Donald Trump has now demonstrated that if people do realise that they're worse off than 4 years before, and you have a government that tells them what a good job they're doing economically, it really, really annoys people. And that may be where we are at now. I'm almost done 20 minutes in my not very well structured talk. The bad news I can cover quickly. The bad news, what is new, what we didn't know a year ago, is Reform are doing remarkably well. In a way, unpredictably well, because the far right have not done well in this country since Mosley. And we put it down to them not having a charismatic leader. Every National Front and BNP leader seemed to have a problem with crisps or some other character flaw. And we were blessed by having really crap, uncharismatic, far-right people, partly including Nigel Farage, who, you know, is a bit of a silly man. Okay? And you can imagine a kind of charismatic Mosley version. But despite not having that, Reform's performance at the election was unpredictably successful for them. There were some predictions of it. I suspect that Rishi Sunak was given them, which is why the election was called early, because the Conservatives know Reform better than anybody else, and they could see if they'd waited 3 months, they could be facing a couple of dozen MPs. If you remember election night and you remember the exit poll and you remember the projection within 5 minutes of it at 10 o'clock on that night, what was it, something like 30 Reform MPs? Right? If it had been, it was scary. And it is scary. There are many council seats around the country, working class Labour council seats, where Reform or the equivalent of Reform, often under the guise of a local independent campaign group, are looking as if they could take the seats at local elections soon. And a disappointing Labour government that looks out of touch and complacent is your kind of ideal breeding ground for that thing to take off. Or if you want to get really scared, it's just worth doing sometimes. Imagine a deal between Kemi and Farage. Right? The Conservatives and Reform carve up the seats between them. 2 different sets of messages to 2 different people. And then that's much more realistic than saying Reform on its own suddenly jump from 4th or 3rd to 2nd or 1st. But it's worth being scared, because if you are the most unequal country in Europe with the biggest cost of living crisis and the poorest 5th in this country, in England, the poorest 5th of people are poorer than the poorest 5th in most of Eastern Europe, we are absolutely peripheral. We can't make steel anymore other than melt it. If the situation is that bad, that is your breeding ground for a far-right rise, led by middle-class voters, right? Angry middle-class voters in leafy areas and suburbs. That's the bad news. The mundane news. The mundane news is probably what I suspect you thought I was going to talk about, which are things like the 2-child limit and winter fuel payments, okay, and rent regulations and controls and inheritance tax and farmers and Jeremy Clarkson, right? Bless him, Jeremy. I've always had a tax proposal for Jeremy, so I'll tell you that. He lives quite near me now. He's got a very large farm just north of Oxford. I thought Jeremy was an ideal case for why you would want inheritance taxation not to stop at 45 or 50%, but to keep on going up. You know, say 60% at over 200 grams, 65% at 300,000 a year, 70% at 400, getting towards 98% at $1 million, 99%, give them a little bit, right? And I call it the Jeremy Clarkson tax. because you're an old man from Doncaster, whoever he's from, posh school Doncaster, and you really like money. And somebody says, look, Jeremy, you're getting quite old, but if you'll drive some cars across Australia, we'll pay you a load of money. And you know you shouldn't do it, you know it's dangerous, you know it's actually not good for you, you should be sitting back in your farm in Oxfordshire. But the temptation of the cash means that you agree and film another series of whatever it's called, Top Gear, on the other side of the planet. Now, I wouldn't stop Jeremy Clarkson from filming any more of those car shows. I would just make him completely free, give him freedom. And that is a 99% tax on the earnings. So he'd only do it if he really wanted to, right? And this is an argument for high rates of progressive taxation. It's actually freedom for the greedy, so that they're not behaving in that way. I've got a couple more minutes. I could do more on mundane. Mundane is probably most of what we have to actually do. You know, the rumour is that they are going to lift the 2-child limit, but it's a kind of sop that we're going to get in 12 months or so on. It's all a bit slow. If you want to learn from any country about the mundane, you don't need to look at the Nordic countries, or France, or Germany, or the Netherlands, or all these places which are much better than us, even though they've got their own problems. There is a country in Europe which has presided over what is almost certainly the largest fall in child poverty compared to what it would have been in the last 10 years. Probably the biggest change since the Berlin Wall came down in 1989. It's a country in which landlords are now controlled over the rent increases they can put up, because 1 in 3 of our children are in private rented. 1 in 3 of our children can be made homeless within 2 months. They'll be housed somewhere, temporary accommodation, but they'll lose all their friends because they've got to move school. How do you control that? You control rent rises. But this country doesn't only do that. 2 out of 7 of its children are very poor. They receive benefits of some kind. And the family of all those children, 2 out of 7 children, are eligible to receive, I think it's about £26 a week. For a family of 3, this is over £4,000 a year. None of their children need go cold or hungry in this country. These measures were introduced during the pandemic. First of all, £10 a week for a child under 6. Now it's gone up to whatever it is, £26. It's going up with inflation for every child under 16 in your family. And it's affordable, instant. They've made the decision that children are not going to be extremely poor. Where is this country? Scotland. Thank you. Scotland. So, right, and I call it the mundane, although it is quite incredible what Scotland have done. In Britain, the lowest rate of child poverty for the last 20 years has been in Scotland. Fewer children are poor in Scotland than in Surrey. Right? That was not the case when I began as a researcher in my 20s, way back in the 1990s. We used to go up to, see if you know, we used to go to Shettleston. Shettleston was the poorest part of Glasgow, and one of the poorest parts of Europe at the time. And this was the worst case at the end of the Thatcher years in England, was what happened to Scotland. And it's quite incredible. I put it down firstly to devolution. I can go through good things that Tony Blair did, but I'm running out of time, so I won't annoy you. But devolution, I think you could say, is an incredible success. I'm not too worried whether it was the SNP or Labour who did the policies. The point is, we're really fortunate. We have had a series of policies put in place within the UK and tested. If you want to do something about the situation now, you don't have to hypothetically say, wouldn't it be nice if we do this? We're doing it. It's just that we don't think of ourselves as we. We don't think of Scotland as part of the UK. In the Department for Education, the word you can't mention is Scotland, because officially, a couple of years ago, only 5 children were excluded from schools in Scotland. In England, we're the exclusion capital of Europe, possibly. possibly permanently excluding more children from schools than the majority of Europe all put together. Right? I can really talk down what's not good about this place, but I'm running out of time. I got maybe a minute or two. Okay, 4 or 5. Okay, being brave. Let's end on being optimistic and being brave. When you are in the situation we are currently in, thanks partly to Liz Truss, reducing the confidence in the international money markets in the UK and in the pound and the amount of money we have to pay if we're going to borrow money. When you are in what in effect is a national emergency and one which will not go away suddenly, the world isn't suddenly going to look at us and go, oh, Britain, it's very close to the United States, so its future's going to look good, isn't it? Right? The world isn't going to look at us and say, we've relaxed our banking regulations. This is the place to trust as being safe in future. The world's not going to look at our economic successes. We, by the way, are the home of more internet gambling than any other country in the world. It makes some money, but it's not impressive. There is nothing we can do in the very short term to make enough money to pay our way easily in the world. That is paying for the food that comes in, the medicines that come in. We can't suddenly create industries that we don't have. We could try and grow some of our largest export industries, but they're already teetering. Overseas students is one of the most profitable things we do as a country. But we take in a lot of overseas students already. Increasing it would be difficult, and you have to look at what we're actually doing with the overseas students and how badly we're treating them over whether they can bring in their families and so on. And if you doubt this, I used to work in Sheffield for 10 years, and towards the end of those 10 years, a colleague and I worked out there were about 70,000 overseas students in the city of Sheffield. Because they came, we no longer had to blow tower blocks up in Sheffield. We didn't have to demolish rows of terraces anymore. The population of the city became stable at 500,000. The city was doing okay economically. There were jobs. It was the new steel. It is the new steel. The average overseas student's family spend £5,000 on a graduation. Now, maybe a bit of waste of, flying in, the hotels and everything else, but more laudable than what Sheffield used to do. Sheffield very cleverly calls it cutlery, knives and forks and spoons. It's not what Sheffield was really making, right? The industry of Sheffield grew up with the First World War because Sheffield was about bullets and armaments. The overseas exports income to South Yorkshire from students, I think it was, when we worked it out, it was £250 million a year, was higher than the overseas exports income of all the metal industry of South Yorkshire. Before you think, well, that's all gone, it's titanium shells, it's Rolls-Royce, it's engines, it's drones. Now, I think it's great that we can make more money as a country, providing an education to people from abroad, than making weapons to export to other countries. But these are the kind of things we're going to have to do. We have to do something. You can't just sit there and expect the rest of the world to give you money if you don't own a third of it. Now, we used to, but we don't anymore. So to be brave, we're going to have to do big things. We're going to have to tax wealth in the short term because we have an emergency situation. And it could get worse. There could be a run on the pound at any time. The wonderful thing about this is it allows you to do things which are very, very hard to reverse. I'll leave you with one example. As I work at the University of Oxford, about 6 colleges have more wealth in Oxford than all the others put together, held in their endowments. Now, I don't think it's fair to just tax rich farmers. I think we should be looking at wealth taxes and proper inheritance taxes across the board for other people as rich as those rich farmers. And not just individuals and families, but also institutions. Say the 20 richest colleges and schools in the country. Say just 20% of their endowment a year, due in April every year. Do that for 4 or 5 years and you've got rid of historic inequalities in this country. I forgot what Eton, I think a few years ago it was 400 or 500 million that Eton had. This is money not being used. This is money being used to grow, to make the endowment even bigger. It's a short-term thing. It won't raise enough to run a country. But we should be talking about raising wealth more equitably so that when those farmers drive their tractors into Westminster, you can say to them, I'm sorry, but we do need the NHS to work next year and the year after, so we will be taxing you on inheritance. But don't worry, we understand you're angry. We're going to make it fairer. We'll also be taking the money off the richest colleges of Oxford and Cambridge as well. And shouldn't you support that, Jeremy Clarkson? And if I was Rachel Reeves, I would announce it with 3 Union Jacks behind me as a really patriotic thing to do. These are the kinds of things that Labour could be doing in the next few years. It's not the radicalism of John McDonnell and Jeremy Corbyn, which was German conservative policy, not as radical as Germany, by the way, almost. The budgets proposed in 2019 would have almost taken us up to German spending levels, but not quite. Okay? This Labour Party veers between being a conservative party in many ways and a right-wing social democratic party in European norms. That's where we're at. That's our kind of Overton window. It can feel like it's very wide, it isn't. But what is new is not the politicians. What is new is the economic circumstances we find ourselves in right now, where things cannot carry on, not because I want to say they can't carry on or I'm a wishful thinking idealistic socialist, but because we actually really have run out of money and you can't just print it, which I'm sure will upset some people in the room. But you can't just print it, because if you just print it, other countries will charge you much, much more to send you the things you need, which isn't just food, which we cannot grow enough of, and medicines, which we cannot manufacture, but as steel girders to repair houses that we have to buy from somebody else now because we cannot make a steel girder in the UK anymore. Right? That is an economic crisis, and it's also an opportunity. Thank you very much for your patience.
Just on questions, just a bit of a reminder, please keep your questions brief and making questions, not speeches, please. I will be aiming to take questions of sort of equal numbers of men and women in the room and all different parts of the room. So I will be aiming to do that as much as I can. So can I see some hands from people who want to ask questions straight away? I've spotted a gentleman in a cream colour sweater at the front. There's a woman at the back. So please do wait for the microphones there.
Thanks for a brilliant presentation, and thanks for a brilliant book. Whether it's coming here. The most striking table is the one on page 426, which lists about 40 countries' trust in the media. And the UK is right at the bottom by a long way. North, south of Macedonia, Serbia, and Greece. That's appalling. How do we deal with that issue of really crap media in which we've got no trust?
So we'll take one more question and then woman standing up. Woman that's standing up. There's a woman already standing up to speak.
Thank you very much. Danny, I'm just, the figures you gave about school exclusions in Scotland and here, do you have any further details of that as to why you think that they're worse here than they are in Scotland? Is it just to do with the equality? Thank you.
Okay. Thanks very much. And you can hear me at the back still? That's good. The media, with many of these tables, it's a case that somebody has to be doing badly, or a country has to be doing badly. And how we ended up there is really interesting, and is probably related to the fact that we were the richest country on earth 100 years ago, and we're not adapting very well to not being great again. You know, the Rupert Murdoch played a game with us. He's still alive but one of his children's going to take over. We were kind of plaything of the Murdoch Empire, but we allowed ourselves to be that. And we allowed the Barclay brothers to do what they wanted and the only thing that took the Barclay brothers down was each other, you know, in court, I think. So that the laissez-faire attitude, this attitude that it is okay if our newspapers are owned by any rich person who wants a plaything, or that the Rothermeres can carry on their game. You know, they have a Christmas party for the Daily Mail every year, at which they raise a glass to the wives of the senior people who work at the newspaper. And I think our tolerance for this should be dramatically reduced. But it extends, in my book, to The Guardian, where when you look at the ownership of The Guardian, it allows The Guardian to be a really weak, supposedly social democratic paper, and sells worse as a result and gets thinner. We have a more radical newspaper now than The Guardian, which is the Financial Times. The politics of the FT, in many ways, are to the left of The Guardian, particularly its data analysis. And the reason for that is that the main market for the Financial Times is Europe. It's the paper of record in Europe. So the FT can't appear to be slightly deranged because people won't buy it on the continent. Right? But the fact that that moves the FT in some ways to being more left-wing than The Guardian is telling of where we are. And then our TV channels, the BBC struggle. They try really hard. Sorry, I'll probably skip this short. The BBC was quite radical in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, particularly in comedy. And that had a lot to do with the fact it involved young people because it was new technology. So don't damn the BBC as always being a kind of reactionary force of wearing dinner jackets and speaking RP. But the BBC has moved as well, and if you're in other countries and you watch it, watch how it picks on China and how we always say nice things about India because it's ours, no matter what Modi does. You know, it is quite despicable in some ways. So I'm agreeing with you that the solution is not necessarily easy, but the great news is that when you're on the bottom of these international charts, the only way is up, okay? And also Berlusconi. You know, we're not in Italy. There are examples of other people, yeah, but we did it without that. Scotland and education. Scotland's had a benefit of having taken education more seriously than England for a long time, partly due to religious reasons, in that it was believed much more in Scotland early on that every child should be able to read, otherwise they're going to burn in hell. Well, it's a hell of an incentive, but when you look at the record of education in Scotland, there were religious reasons why it was taken seriously before England. Now, it's a complicated story about how we've got to where we are, and a lot of children are suspended or moved around in Scotland. It's not quite as good as only 5 a year. But Scotland models itself much more on mainland Europe, where in somewhere like Belgium, if a child has a knife, which is the most serious thing in the school, if a child has a knife, the agent of the state, they're called the agent of the state, comes, removes that child, but also takes them that day to their new school. We just don't have that attitude. We've gone for a Heinz Beans 57 varieties of school, all competing in England, where if you want to maximise the performance of your school, you maximise the number of exclusions you do of children who are not going to do well, or don't let them in the first place in various ways. Very different attitude in Scotland, which means that different words are used in policy documents about children in Scotland. And it's a bit scary because you can see a kind of moral form of independence already happening in how things are taught. The exact words have gone from my memory, but it is, children are thought of as not the enemy in documents in Scotland, whereas more and more in England, when you talk to exasperated teachers and they say somebody like me, I don't understand how hard it is. It's tricky. And we have things like Teach First, where fairly posh young graduates are put into normal schools where they don't do well as teachers because they're not normal kids. And it has the title Teach First because this is what you do before you make your money in the city. It's kind of like doing good. It's going to be hard to unravel this. We have really, really damaged our education system. I promise a last long answer. I grew up in Oxford. I grew up, luckily at the time, just after the 11 plus had been abolished. Nobody knew what school to send their kids to because they're all comprehensives. So you went to the nearest school, right? It was a short period of time, the best we've ever had. People came from Finland to study our schools and copied them. And that's the Finnish education system now. But now in my home city of Oxford, the poshest comprehensive, which used to be the secondary modern, is now recommended by Tatler magazine, and you're paying £1 million for a 2-bed terrace near it. And the worst off comprehensive is in the bottom 20 in the country and occasionally has riots. And nobody in their right mind would let their child go there. And we've become used to this. It's incredible difference. Oh, and a third of kids go private. Nowhere else in the world has 7% nationally going private. Nowhere else in the world, it used to be Chile, but no longer, spends as much on private education and exclusion. Doesn't happen anywhere else. Nowhere else in the world allows its children to be divided like this. So if I compare Oxford to its twin cities of Leiden and Bonn, they look like absolute utopias for education. But they're real. Right? It is possible for your children to mix and know each other and not to spend as much as you can on a house, all privately, primarily so your children do not meet other children. Right? It's a terrible situation that we've got ourselves in.
Okay, so we'll take another couple of questions. I can see somebody in the middle, and is there a second one to follow this one? And there's a person at this side. So we'll take.
Could some income come from more properties, duchies, etc.?
The person who's got the microphone. The person who's got the microphone I was pointing to.
Yes. Could you repeat the question?
Could some income come from more properties, duchies?
Yeah. Duchies, yeah.
Okay. Thanks very much indeed for your brilliant talk. One of the issues that you raised was the reform and the way in which it did so well at the last election, and the way in which it's securing a lot of votes in local elections at the moment. And if there was a general election in 4 years' time, which there will be, it could be in a very, very powerful position. How do you think Labour can
Thank you for those two questions. In a way, for me, they're related. There is what I would like to do in an ideal world and what is practical. So I think it was the Duchy of Cornwall that you're mentioning, the royal family and property. As you can probably guess, what I'd like to do is not have a royal family, right? But it's not, but I know, and of course you shouldn't, but I don't even think Labour in 2017 were mentioning not having a royal family. What I would do, okay, as a step towards not having a royal family, is say, why can't we have a normal European royal family? There are lots of royal families in Europe. They're all remarkably cheaper than ours and remarkably better behaved. Okay? So negotiations to move towards a normal royal family, which includes taking back to the state the lands requisitioned by this small group of Germans, or whoever they actually are. Sorry, shouldn't be mean to the Battenbergs, whatever, of that. But, and you could even sell this is why I can't be a politician, because I couldn't keep a straight face. But I could, again, I'm imagining those Union Jacks behind you, which of course I hate. You know, but given they've gone and put all these Union Jacks behind them, well, use it. Go, I care and love my country so much that I want the royal family to be a success in future. So they need to be smaller, okay, to be a success. On reform and the middle class going for them, what's your question about how Labour can best tackle this? People want big changes. They want a promise of it being good again. They have not just a rose-tinted memory. So we are, most of us, the same age. So you know, you're not fooling yourself that when you were young, for the majority of people in this room, there was full employment, right? That really did happen. It wasn't a dream. There was full employment, admittedly more for men than for women, but there was full employment, which meant that if you didn't like your job in Lewes, you swore at your boss and you walked out, and you went and got another job, right? And that was freedom. And you're not deluding yourself to think that a young couple in their 20s could get a mortgage and start a family and have a house and have some form of security. That happened. And you're not deluding yourself if you think that we have the most successful social housing system in the world, or the best health service in the world, or at one point the most progressive education system in the world. Now, reform doesn't put it like that. Reform puts it, we used to be great, and a bit of that is because we owned other places. And then a bit of, London isn't like what it was, is it? Right? And lots of dog whistling and nastinesses. You don't beat reform with mugs that say British jobs for British workers. Right? That's just stupid. You don't do that. You beat reform by promising people in future those simple things: near full employment, the ability to start a family, have a home, feel safe, and admitting that to get to that is going to require quite big changes to society, not tinkering. So at least you've got an offer that's worth voting for. Otherwise, in 4 years' time, you're saying to people, oh, nominally our GDP went up slightly more than this other member of the G7. Can you imagine standing on the doorstep and saying to people, oh, nominally our GDP went up slightly more than another member of the G7. You know, please vote Labour. I mean, for God's sake, right? And this is why it's worth saying now within the Labour Party, and it needs to be said by party members and people outside of Westminster, because if you're in Westminster, you finally got your ministerial post, you've got your ministerial car, you're going to the dinner parties every night, being very important, you've got advisors, it all feels okay. You've got your statistics coming in telling you you're doing well, you completely ignore the personal polling of the leader. I presume that nobody's allowed to show Keir just how he's doing on the personal polling. But they are separated. They do not know. They think they're doing a good job. They think they're doing grown-up economics, particularly if you're the Chancellor and you're married to somebody in the Treasury who tells you you're doing grown-up economics. The OBR says you can only do this. They think they're the grown-ups in the room. And that's dangerous because they think they're doing well and they think that this polling that's going on is just going to go away and somehow they're going to replicate what happened earlier this year, which only happened because of Reform splitting the vote. Labour got fewer votes in 2024 than in 2019. That's the most important lesson of the election. Despite the Conservatives being the most appalling in the entire history of their party, right? The oldest political party in the world in its worst ever years. And when people are offered an alternative to the worst ever years of the Conservative Party, fewer of them bothered to go out and vote than did in 2019, when they were told by The Guardian not to vote Labour, in effect, because you couldn't trust that man who was leading the party. It's quite incredible what's happened.
We may have other questions entirely unrelated. I've certainly got questions about that, but I shall save mine for a bit. So, over to the audience. So there's somebody near the back on that side, and there's also somebody right at the back. James, got a hand up by the table with the red gloves on.
Do you think do you detect any appetite amongst the current Labour government for any more of the creative money-raising projects? You mentioned obviously levying funds on the endowments of Oxford and Cambridge colleges, and obviously they try to raise money by taxing farmers. Do you think there's any other prospect of quite new and imaginative ways of raising money in the pipeline, and how well connected you are with racial reasons in most thoughts?
You could take the microphone back to the person with the red gloves behind you. Behind you, that way. You're going that way. James, stand up so we can see you.
Thanks. Would you mind saying a little bit more about the role of trade unions? I mean, there was obviously a strike wave as well, which impacted on pay rises. And is there anything more that unions and the Labour Party can do to get increased union membership intensity?
Thank you. So, short answers. The Treasury are looking all the time. They're doing a lot of closing of loopholes on inheritance taxes, which I think is very good. Unless, so a lot of kind of quite boring work. What annoys me is that it's done grudgingly. It's done as, we wish we didn't have to increase the inheritance tax on you, right? But it shouldn't be being done grudgingly. It should be, you're so lucky you're able to contribute. Even though you won't be alive at the point when you make your contribution. Yeah? You're so lucky that in death we will help you make the country that you clearly care about better. And okay, some kid's not going to, get so many hundreds of acres, but that land is still going to be farmed by somebody, and it's not the end. Non-doms is one argument. We are beginning to get to, there have been so many studies, the rich won't leave London. It's really sticky. There's been lots of studies of where the rich will leave. And the rich like London for numerous reasons, so you can increase the tax on the rich quite a lot in London, and this is the international rich, and keep them there, so that's worth doing. But I just wish this was done with some enthusiasm. Private flights, which a lot of the rest of Europe has kind of taxed incredibly, partly because of carbon. We have enormous numbers of private flights going from small private airports around London, right? And idealistically, you'd say the planet's burning, let's just stop it. I would go halfway and say, let's just raise a lot of tax money. And yes, that would halve the number of private flights as well. Trade unions, there's a graph in the book. I do have to have a little yellow magnifying glass on the graph, because although the strikes of this decade have been dramatic compared to the strikes of the last 20 years, and you'll remember not knowing whether you can catch a train or not, because he was so clever. So the RMT, the thing is, you announce a strike, and then you cancel it the day before, right? None of your members lose any money, but of course, if you're travelling by train. So we've had successful strikes in recent years for the first time in decades, but they're tiny compared to the 70s. And the strikes of the 70s were really important because they meant that when we had inflation in the first half of the 70s, and till about 77, 78, most people didn't become worse off because their wages increased by inflation because of the trade unions. The rich watched their money disappearing with inflation to do it. Our unions are weak compared to most of Europe. Our unions tend to be a bit self-satisfied because they're representing better off people, particularly better off people in the public sector. And I think there's a lot of work to be done within the unions to realise that society matters as much. So that, not your normal talk from, but my union, University Lecturers Union, we're constantly complaining that we're not getting the pay rises we deserve. I work in a building where 500 people are employed. About 60 of us are permanent academics out of 500. We are the highest paid people in the building. And my union is arguing that our pay should go up, right? And the unions need to begin to realise that they have to be a part of reducing the inequality. The low point for me of this was going to a meeting at TEC House 15 odd years ago, and the airline pilots union chief standing up and talking about the deal he just got, where the pilots flying the Qantas flights around the world were on $250,000 a year, and he described them as the vanguard of the working class. Now, airline pilots getting $250,000 a year is not the vanguard of the working class. And so unions are absolutely vital, but we need unions that are a little bit more like the French unions and understanding about society as a whole, and then more people will join them, because you're joining something where you don't just join it in case they try and sack you and you need some help. You join it because you believe in it, and to get young people to believe in it, it mustn't be about greed of getting higher wages for better paid people.
Okay, I'd quite like to follow up that with a question of my own, which is really about the impact that you think is going to happen from the employment reforms that Labour is bringing in. Because one of the things that's happened recently, in recent years, is that there's been grassroots unions growing up amongst the kinds of workers who are usually immigrant workers, and they are usually working in a very low-paid, contracted out economy, where they're working in things like cleaning and catering and getting really, really important. And they started saying that conventional unions don't do it for them, they started their own grassroots ones. And one of the things I'm not sure about is how far Labour's reforms in the labour market, in employment terms, are going to help people like them.
But let me do that one on its own. It's an internal, well, it appears to be, I am not, I was involved in the last leadership of the Labour Party. I'm not, because of that, I'm not involved in London with this one. But you can see the divisions. You can see this is what Angela Rayner wants. And she is increasingly powerful and able and determined and knows how to do Westminster. She taught herself in Parliament. That was her education, which is a far better education than, say, doing a master's degree in Oxford, which our Prime Minister did. And there's this battle inside. over innovative things. There's people like Wes, who wants to do certain things with the National Health Service. But there are other ministers who are far more left-wing and want to do things differently. The whole question about the employment bill is to what extent it'll be watered down or not. I'm quite glad they've increased national insurance, the employer's contribution, because we have a lot of people doing too many jobs, doing 2 jobs or 3 jobs because it's cheap to employ people in Britain. The vast majority of our university students are working. We have far more people doing things that don't really need to be done. In effect, almost servants, cycling around delivering your pizza because you can't be bothered to go and get it, right? And if somebody is going to do that, it's a dangerous job, cycling around delivering food for people. You need some security, you need better pay, and if that results in it being more expensive to have takeaway food delivered to your house at night, right, that seems fine. But it's a battle within the Labour leadership and the party at the moment that is going on. And it's between small tinkering and more ambitious. Now, from the other side, more ambitious would be described as utopian, idealistic, airy-fairy, not possible. We'll lose this vote because we've got these Conservatives to vote for us because we're better at managing the economy than the Conservative Party. And everybody lives in their own reality, in their own mind of what they think the world is. The current Labour leadership is still recovering from having fought a battle with other people in the Labour Party. Even though they're in power, the main enemy hasn't been the Conservatives, the main enemy has been within the party. Hence the purges continuing and so on. And it's taken some time to actually get that out and realise the main enemy is not other people in Labour, it's fascism and reform. And that's what Labour needs to realise. It's not just facing the Conservatives anymore, it's facing something far more frightening than a Conservative government in a country doing worse than it's done for decades and decades, with a model ready to be imported from the United States. And but I honestly believe this. The vast majority of Labour MPs can never become junior ministers. There are too many of them. Most of them are going and doing their surgeries on Fridays. They are going to the poorest constituencies in the country without exception. The Liberals and the Greens don't represent a single of the very, very poor. And if they're seeing their constituents, they're seeing a terrible situation. And you step back and look at that and say, you're going to need to work together as a large party and offer something decent. Otherwise, it's going to fall apart and it's going to become factional and you're going to start shouting at each other. And that is my worry.
So, further questions. So there's now an extra rods in years, back over there, and there's a woman on the front.
Yeah.
Thank you. Why is the Labour government so resistant to introducing a proper wealth tax?
Yeah. Do we take the man as well?
Take the person. The person sat next to Ross who's got the...
Thank you very much. Really interesting. My question is about the tax proposals you're discussing here. They're focusing all on the very, very top of the income distribution. Do you think it's possible to restore security and the level of public services which people hope for without the tax increase on people in the middle and only slightly above the average? And if so, is it actually politically possible, or do you run into problems of middle class people worrying about that?
Yeah. So I'll do yours first. I think this is what happened between 2017 and 2019. The proposals of the Labour Party which were to, in 5 years, increase public spending not quite to German levels, which is just European average, would have hit the top 5% particularly badly. The top 5%, by the way, think of themselves as the middle of the middle class. They don't realise where they are. And my characterisation of this is that if you live in North London and you're a senior Guardian, last time I had a go at the Guardian, but you're a senior accountant in the Guardian, I don't know, on about £150,000, and you're sending your girl to North London Collegiate School, and that Labour Party had won in 2019, your life would change completely. You wouldn't be able to send your daughter to that school. They might have to go to the local comprehensive in London. And it's the Guardian, it scared them. And hence lukewarm about Corbyn. If we're going to get to normal level taxation, the very rich don't do it for very much. The wealth taxes only work for a short amount of time on the endowments. It's like it's a windfall tax. It doesn't last for long. You should certainly increase council tax bands. You know, you can go right up to letter Z, you know, and you can revalue houses. Nobody wants their house to be revalued low because it's a public valuation. So when you come to sell it, so that could be done. Temporarily unpopular. Most people adapt within 2 years to a changing situation, which is why it would have made sense to have done that now. All proportional property tax, or again being utopian, a proper land tax, you know, which people like Winston Churchill argued for. And it's not just the middle class who are going to have to pay more tax. Normal European average level of tax is what I'm talking about, but we haven't paid that for decades. Working class people are going to have to pay more, and you can't have not paying any tax in the first 10 or £12,000. 47% of adults pay no income tax. 47%. So the state isn't something you feel you contribute to. You need the benefits to increase, but also the taxation, so you're all part of something together. Why don't they do it? I think at the top of Labour, there is a belief that those people who make money are special and gifted and partly deserve the money that they've made. So our Prime Minister, you can search his father, he's called Rodney Starmer, Company's House, Rodney Starmer, Company Director. Occupation, toolmaker. Right? Not his fault he's a company director. I could easily be a company director. Many of you will be company directors. If any of you want to avoid paying tax, well, I like paying tax, I'm slightly weird. I could reduce my tax bill completely legally by creating a company with just me. I would be a wealth creator then, wouldn't I? Okay? And this is the thinking, and I'm being cynical, and probably too cynical. I'll never forget Richard Wilkinson, who published with Kate Pickett The Spirit Level, saying that some of the greatest support they got for greater equality was amongst small business owners in Yorkshire, who really hated greedy, big business owners. But I think there is a worshipping of wealth and the idea that it is okay for some people to have a lot of wealth. The Peter Mandelson phrase, if you remember it verbatim, that's the equivalent of I do not care how much money the rich have as long as they pay their taxes. You end up with Elon Musk if you do not care how much money the rich have. Slightly personal, if any of you got a vote and haven't voted, I don't care who you vote for Chancellor of the University of Oxford. If you went, just don't vote for Peter, please.
Okay, I think might need to push back slightly on the concept that the Guardian was responsible for our catastrophic defeat in 2019. I think there were other factors at play there, if I might so say. Let's take some more questions. There's somebody towards the back of the hall on my left, your right, the side. And somebody else almost next, so there's two people almost next to each other towards the back. Grace Lee person who had your hand up.
Thank you for your talk, Dan. It's great. Can I ask you to repeat one thing? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
One thing, which was you talked about the window between, I think it's the Tories on one side, and then it's quite a long, complex phrase to describe the somewhat limited other side. Could you repeat that? I thought it was great, but I can't remember what you said.
There's a story of my life of thinking I've said something and then I'm not going to remember it. I'll do the other one first. Yeah, this central belief system of the grown-ups in the room. I'll never forget going to a meeting years ago, chaired by the president of Royal Society or something, where there were right-wing Labour people and left-wing Tories. And he said, oh, it's great to have the grown-ups in the room here. You know, we're all the same, really. It kind of worked for a long time for Britain. You know, when I was a schoolboy, we had a school trip to France. My mum gave me £1. You got 10 francs for £1. We were much richer than Europe. So I had 10 francs. You bought a bottle of wine for 3 francs, right? So you can see why there is this, oh, this model works, you do it this way. We've sold off a lot of our stuff abroad already. There's a lovely book called Who Owns Britain? And another one about sovereign nation. So much of this country is actually owned by international capital now. So I just think, and again, I'm not being radical. I'm just saying, look at Europe. Look at those countries which are doing better than us. Don't aim to go from being the failure in the class, the country that ranks lowest on so many things, and say, oh, we can create revolution and a utopia. Right? It's unlikely. Aim to at least be European average, which is utopia compared to what we're used to do that. But that would involve things like seriously looking at Thames Water, to give you a concrete example, and not looking at 2 sets of private investors, one of which I think want to charge us 8% a year, bond holders, and another 6%. Whereas we can actually borrow money at 4% and take it over. But look at Thames Water, which matters where I live, and for London, and say, have the investors and the shareholders and the capital firms behind it acted irresponsibly? Are you going to pass a law to put a duty on them to behave in a certain way? Can you think about making the value of their investments negative, if that's what they've done? And yes, international law on property matters, but when you've got an issue of supplying drinkable water for London and the Thames Valley, then we've got to a particular point where carrying on the old model will not necessarily get you a decent water supply. This is what it's becoming easy or easier to say we need to do something different, because we've taken a neoliberal experiment and we've run it so long that we've really, really mucked the country up, which makes it easier to do. The Overton window of the politics. Our political parties tend to be very, very near each other, and we tend to think they're really far apart. If you go and spend time in another country, I once got to spend 5 months in New Zealand, and every evening at 7 o'clock, I'd have a glass of white wine, New Zealand white wine, and I'd turn the Today programme on. And after 4 months, everybody sounded pompous, right? Because I was living in New Zealand. Accents that you thought weren't, they all sounded pompous compared to being in New Zealand. But if you're here, there's a battle to be fought. We're all different. Tories are really nasty and rich. We're for the workers. Our political parties all moved to the left from 1918 to the 1970s. The Tories built more council houses than Labour at one point. Then they all moved to the right. Blair took Labour much farther to the right than it had been before. He pushed the Tories off a cliff so that they left the normal European Conservative grouping in 2014 and joined a grouping of Alternative for Deutschland. The small period of possible readjustment with the largest social movement of Europe of 500,000 people. They weren't all Trotskyists. But we have the Financial Times has a graph, which is in the book, had to pay £700 to get it in colour. The FT, I like them, but they're still a bit greedy. The Financial Times has a graph where they've got a circle for every political party in every affluent country in the world and every middling country in the world, and where they stand on the scale from left to right on economic policy, determined by thousands of political scientists worldwide. And you look at the graph and there's hundreds of circles, every party you can think of. And on the very far right of the entire graph are the British Conservatives and the Liz Truss, right? Somebody has to be extreme, and we're extreme. And because our Tories became so extreme, Labour drift over this way and do what social democratic parties in the rest of Europe wouldn't do, or what Labour wouldn't have done in the 60s and 70s. Of course you feed the third child. You do not have a policy of giving less benefits to child number 3 and 4 because you think that young parents are going to make a calculation to put a condom on after they've had 2 kids. Right? The policy was eugenic. George Osborne brought the 2-child policy in because he didn't want the lower orders breeding too much. And he seriously thought that people make an economic calculation about the number of children they have. I mean, it's imbecile politics apart from being nasty and eugenics. So why on earth are we carrying it on? Our Labour Party is carrying on a eugenic policy.
Which is a slightly sombre note on this journey. We have run out of time, I regret to say, because I'm sure there are other questions people wanted to raise. But we will have time for, I think, Danny's going to be around during the break, so there will be time, I think, for a bit further conversation. So I'm going to hand over now to Mark, who's going to tell you some stuff about the rest of the day, and then we will have a break before we move on to our other speakers for the afternoon. So thank you very much.